I didn't discover my husband's infidelity through lipstick on a collar or a stray text. I found it in mismatched numbers, forged signatures, and the gaze of a woman used to taking what isn't hers. On the penthouse floor, his boss leaned in and whispered, "Let's spend the evening together." She thought she was dragging a betrayed wife into a dirty bargain. Completely unaware I had prepared for this night like a controlled demolition. My name is Savannah Wright. At 37, I have learned through rigorous professional experience that the loudest, most extravagant rooms usually serve to hide the quietest, most devastating crimes. Tonight, the rooftop of the Halcyon Crest Hotel in the heart of Charlotte was completely deafening. It was the annual charity gala for Crown Meridian Hospitality, a massive event meticulously designed by public relations experts to disguise aggressive corporate greed as gentle philanthropy. The air inside the ballroom was heavy. It smelled of expensive floral arrangements, top-tier gin, and the sharp, undeniable scent of desperation from people trying to climb the social ladder. I stood near a towering pillar of imported white marble, wearing a minimalist, severe black dress that felt less like evening wear and more like tactical armor. All around me, the crowd was a swirling sea of intentional, desperate ostentation. There were shimmering sequins reflecting the light, heavy diamond necklaces, bespoke silk suits, and tightly knotted silk ties. Every single person in the room was there trying to be seen, trying to secure their next deal or their next executive position. I, however, was there strictly to observe. Across the massive room, bathed in the soft, golden light cascading from 3 enormous crystal chandeliers, stood my husband. His name is Adrian Blake. At 31, he possessed the exact kind of youth, vitality, and effortless beauty that naturally made older, wealthier individuals want to hand over their money and their absolute trust. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo that hugged the broad lines of his shoulders without a single flaw. He stood in the center of a circle, holding a crystal flute of champagne, nodding earnestly and laughing brightly at a group of heavy-set, gray-haired investors. Adrian was the undisputed rising star of the Crown Meridian Empire. Tonight was heavily rumored to be his grand coronation. The whispers floating over the music of the live jazz band suggested loudly that he was about to receive the largest, most lucrative promotion of his entire life. He was on the verge of becoming a vice president before he even had a single gray hair on his head. Standing there under the bright lights, he looked absolutely magnificent. He also looked exactly like a stranger. The bitter truth of the matter was that Adrian was not the genius orchestrating his own meteoric rise. He was simply a highly polished, incredibly handsome instrument being played by a master manipulator. That master was currently gliding across the polished wood of the ballroom floor. Her name was Helena Voss. She was the chief executive officer of Crown Meridian. Helena was a terrifying force of nature wrapped tightly in expensive emerald silk. She was deeply attractive, utterly ruthless, and entirely accustomed to consuming whatever or whoever she desired without a second thought. She did not just walk into a room, she systematically acquired it. Every eye in the venue tracked her fluid movements. Every mid-level executive unconsciously straightened their posture and sucked in their stomach as she approached their vicinity. And then, inevitably, her sharp gaze found me. The smile that slowly spread across Helena's face was deeply predatory, poorly masked as polite, host-like charm. She approached our section of the room, sliding her slender arm through Adrian's with a practiced, intimate ease that made my stomach tighten. The tightening was not born of jealousy, but rather the cold, sobering realization of the massive audit I was about to perform on their entire lives. She looked at me exactly the way one looks at a discarded napkin left on a banquet table. I was the mandatory +1. I was the boring civilian who simply did not understand the high-stakes game they were playing. "Savannah, darling," Helena purred, her voice perfectly modulated to rise just above the clinking of heavy crystal glasses and the energetic jazz ensemble. "I am so incredibly thrilled that you could make it tonight. Adrian has been working such long, grueling hours for us lately. I simply had to borrow him from you to get things done. He is quite dedicated to his career, I replied calmly, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. I did not offer her a polite smile. I did not adjust my posture. I refused to give her the petty satisfaction of sensing my insecurity or my anger. Helena's dark eyes flashed with a brief, highly dismissive amusement. She reached out and patted Adrian's lapel. It was an incredibly intimate gesture, executed deliberately in plain sight to establish her territory. Then, she turned her full, overwhelming attention directly to me. Behind us, the band smoothly transitioned into a much louder, more upbeat, and chaotic tempo. A group of loud investors nearby raised their glasses in a synchronized, boisterous toast to a record-breaking financial quarter. Amidst the sudden cheering and the swelling music, Helena stepped uncomfortably close to me. She placed a firm hand on the small of my back, smoothly guiding me away from Adrian and the surrounding circle of corporate sycophants. She steered me purposefully toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the glittering, sprawling skyline of Charlotte. The sleeping city far below us looked like a massive, glowing circuit board of gold and silver light. We stood side by side, two women starkly framed against the darkness of the night. To any casual observer watching from the ballroom floor, it looked exactly like a touching mentorship moment. It appeared to be a powerful, gracious executive sharing a quiet, supportive word with her young protégé's lovely wife. Helena leaned in very close. I could distinctly smell the sharp, expensive citrus notes of her designer perfume fiercely mingled with the scent of aged champagne on her breath. Her painted lips brushed against the cold air right next to my left ear. "Let's spend the evening together." She said the words softly, but they carried the unmistakable weight of a direct command. She thought she was being incredibly clever. She firmly believed she was inviting a weak, betrayed, and helpless wife into a dirty, humiliating bargain, offering me a pathetic front-row seat to my own domestic destruction. She expected sudden tears. She expected a loud, embarrassing scene. She fully expected me to break down, or flee toward the elevators, or scream at her, thereby allowing her to effortlessly paint me to the entire room as the unstable, violently jealous spouse who simply could not handle her magnificent husband's massive success. I did not feel a single drop of jealousy. I did not feel the stinging, burning heat of public humiliation. As I slowly turned my head to look directly at her, I felt absolutely nothing but the sterile, freezing, mathematical clarity of a senior auditor finally locating the missing, fatal variable in a fraudulent ledger. I looked at Helena Voss not as a romantic rival, and certainly not as the powerful woman sleeping with my husband. I looked at her exactly as I would look at a glaring, catastrophic error in a corporate balance sheet. I saw her as a massive liability that was about to bankrupt her entire empire. I purposefully let the silence between us stretch out. 1 full second, 2 full seconds. The jazz band behind us hit a loud, brassy crescendo. The room roared with laughter and the clinking of silver on china. I maintained absolute eye contact with Helena and gave her a very slight, almost completely imperceptible smile. For exactly half of a second, the perfect corporate mask she wore slipped. Helena completely froze. The supreme, arrogant confidence in her dark eyes violently flickered, instantly replaced by a sudden, sharp jolt of genuine confusion. She did not understand the smile. It was absolutely not the emotional reaction she had calculated in her head. It was the precise moment she realized, deep in her chest, that she might have fatally misread the room and the woman standing next to her. The rest of my verbal answer hung heavily in the air, left deliberately unspoken for the time being. She did not know that I was absolutely not there to negotiate terms. She did not know that this was far from a simple social visit or a quiet surrender. To fully understand exactly why I stood in the most expensive, exclusive room in the city, holding a simple glass of sparkling water and coldly preparing to completely detonate the professional and personal lives of the two people standing beside me. One would have to rewind the clock. Exactly 5 weeks and 4 days prior to this gala, I officially stopped being a supportive wife and actively started being a financial investigator. The total destruction of Adrian Blake and Helena Voss did not begin in this glittering, noisy ballroom. It began in the quiet, mundane, silent corners of my own home, triggered by a single, carelessly misplaced digital file. I absolutely did not come to the Halcyon Crest Hotel to cry over a broken marriage. I came to definitively end a hunt. To truly comprehend how a modern marriage quietly transforms into a hostile corporate takeover, you have to examine the original operating agreement. I did not inherit a massive trust fund, nor did I possess a prestigious family name that magically opened heavy mahogany doors. Every single thing I owned, every ounce of respect I commanded in the corporate world, was built on a bedrock of brutal, exhausting, uncompromising work. I am the sole founder and principal executive of Right Ledger Advisory. We are a boutique but highly formidable consulting firm operating out of a sleek, deliberately minimalist office in the financial district of Charlotte. We specialize in a very specific, utterly unforgiving niche complex financial risk assessment, deep contract auditing, and aggressive restructuring for mid to large-scale hospitality and service corporations. My entire professional reputation was forged in the relentless fires of 80-hour work weeks, missed holidays, and countless sleepless nights spread across a decade and a half. I built a terrifyingly solid name in the industry for possessing an uncanny ability to spot the single misplaced decimal point, the buried shell company, or the hidden liability clause that could effortlessly sink a $500 million acquisition. People hire me when they are bleeding money and cannot find the wound. I simply do not miss a single number, ever. When Adrian and I first crossed paths, exactly 7 years ago, he was completely unmoored. He was a 24-year-old junior sales representative hawking mediocre supply chain software with a dazzling, cinematic smile and absolutely zero structural foundation. He possessed a raw, undeniable magnetism and a face that naturally made older. Wealthier people want to agree with whatever he was enthusiastically pitching. However, his ambition was entirely unfocused, scattered like loose change on a sidewalk. Our relationship did not ignite with a chaotic, overwhelming burst of poetic romance or a desperate, blinding passion. It was built, rather carefully, on a deep mutual understanding of raw potential. I looked at Adrian and saw the magnificent framework of a highly successful executive buried under bad habits, cheap, ill-fitting suits, and a desperate desire to be liked by everyone in the room. Over the next 5 years, I systematically dismantled his lack of direction. I did not simply write checks to effortlessly fund his lifestyle. I financed his part-time Master of Business Administration degree. But more importantly, I enforced the brutal, daily discipline required to actually sit down and complete it. I spent countless Sunday evenings completely overhauling his fragmented resumes, turning his vague accomplishments into hard, actionable data points. I sat across our sprawling kitchen table for hours on end, relentlessly drilling him on how to speak the coded, elevated language of high-net-worth investors. I taught him how to read the power dynamics in a boardroom, when to hold eye contact, and exactly when to deploy a calculated pause for maximum impact. I introduced him to the exact right power brokers at the exact right charity dinners. I provided the stable, unshakable scaffolding that allowed him to build a towering professional persona he could never have constructed with his own 2 hands. He brought the charm. I built the engine. Our marriage was a highly optimized joint venture, and for a long time, it yielded incredible, undeniable returns. We were a formidable team. When Crown Meridian Hospitality aggressively recruited Adrian 2 years ago, offering him a position with a massive base salary and incredible stock options, I viewed it as the ultimate, glorious validation of our shared project. He walked into that towering glass headquarters not as a lost kid, but as a polished, formidable force. It did not take long for Helena Voss to take notice of the brilliant, shining new acquisition in her corporate arsenal. Helena possessed a well-documented, legendary weakness for beautiful, useful things. and Adrian was exceptionally beautiful and endlessly useful. She quickly identified his magnetic presentation skills and his effortless ability to charm a room full of skeptical, aggressive shareholders. She immediately pulled him out of the standard, grueling middle management trenches and placed him directly into her exclusive, high-altitude orbit. At first, I felt nothing but genuine, uncomplicated pride. I assumed it was the standard, predictable dynamic of a powerful chief executive aggressively mentoring a favored, high-performing protege. When he started working late into the evening, logging 70-hour weeks, I simply ordered expensive takeout, poured myself a glass of wine, and reviewed my own ledgers. I was entirely happy that the massive investment I had poured into my husband was finally paying off in the form of accelerated promotions and substantial performance bonuses. But then, the quiet, subtle rhythms of our domestic life began to severely fracture. It started with the subtle weaponization of his communication devices. Adrian used to leave his phone lying casually on the kitchen island, the screen facing upward, notifications pinging harmlessly while we cooked dinner together. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the phone began to live strictly inside his tailored pockets. When it did make a rare appearance on a flat surface, the screen was always placed firmly face down, like a secret being smothered. His schedule, once meticulously shared and color-coded on our digital household calendar, became a chaotic, fluid blur of vague obligations. There were sudden, poorly explained strategic dinners with unnamed stakeholders that stretched well past midnight. There were urgent, last-minute business trips to Chicago and Miami that required him to pack a bag with frantic, nervous energy, barely looking me in the eye as he rushed out the front door. He began to carry a strange, lingering scent when he returned home, a heavy, expensive, intoxicating floral note that absolutely did not belong in my house, in my personal collection, or in any standard corporate boardroom. Furthermore, he developed a bizarre, highly defensive impatience whenever I casually inquired about our shared financial paperwork or our upcoming quarterly tax filings. A man who used to eagerly seek my financial counsel, who used to beg me to review his expense reports, suddenly treated my basic questions like hostile, unprovoked interrogations. If I asked why a credit card bill was unusually high, he would dramatically sigh, rub his temples, and accuse me of not understanding the immense pressure of executive networking. I watched the man I had meticulously built slowly morph into a highly defensive, incredibly secretive stranger who flinched slightly whenever a door closed too loudly. The defining moment, the exact, irreversible second the supportive wife died and the forensic investigator took over, occurred on a remarkably ordinary Tuesday evening. We were sitting in our quiet living room. I was deeply engrossed in reviewing a massive stack of risk assessment documents for a new client, and Adrian was pouring himself a second, very heavy glass of expensive bourbon from our crystal decanter. Out of absolutely nowhere, he broke a 45-minute silence to ask me a series of highly specific, entirely unprompted questions about the internal mechanics of Right Ledger Advisory. He took a sip of his bourbon, cleared his throat, and said, "Savannah, out of pure curiosity, how ironclad is the legal separation between your corporate business accounts and our joint marital assets?" I looked at his handsome, nervous face over the thin rim of my reading glasses. In all our years together, through all the late-night study sessions, the endless resume revisions, and the meticulous career planning, Adrian had never once shown even a fractional interest in the microscopic legal and financial mechanics of my firm. He had always been perfectly content to let me handle the complex, boring legalities while he focused entirely on the grand, sweeping presentations. I carefully measured my breathing, ensuring my heart rate remained perfectly steady. "It is completely impenetrable," I replied smoothly. "Why do you ask?" "Just thinking about long-term wealth management." He lied, offering a tight, unconvincing smile. "And what about your soul-signing authority? Do you ever delegate that for independent corporate reviews?" Sitting there on our custom Italian leather sofa, listening to my husband stumble through questions he had clearly been meticulously coached to ask by someone else. A terrifying, absolute clarity washed over me. He was not asking out of sudden, loving curiosity about my life's work. He was actively probing for structural weaknesses. He was looking for an unlocked door in the digital vault of my company. He was trying to figure out how my name and my unblemished reputation could be leveraged. My heart did not break in that moment. It simply stopped beating for a romantic partner and immediately started beating for a target. I gave him a generic, perfectly boring, mathematically sound answer about standard corporate liability protections. I watched his shoulders physically drop as he relaxed, completely unaware that he had just handed a master auditor the detailed blueprint to his own destruction. He took another sip of his bourbon, genuinely believing he was playing a clever, high-stakes game of corporate chess. He did not realize he had just invited the house to inspect his marked cards. The real danger of a corporate betrayal is that it rarely announces itself with a dramatic confession. Instead, it quietly disguises itself as administrative routine. Exactly 1 week after Adrian probed me for the legal vulnerabilities of my firm, he casually introduced the poison pill into our dining room. He was leaning against the marble counter, casually swirling a glass of expensive red wine, looking like the perfect portrait of an exhausted but triumphant executive. He sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck, and complained about a massive bridge loan Crown Meridian was trying to close. They were aggressively attempting to refinance a newly acquired chain of luxury boutique hotels on the West Coast. "The debt structuring is an absolute nightmare," he told me, his tone perfectly calibrated to sound overwhelmed and seeking comfort. "The underwriters are being incredibly difficult about the risk ratios. Honestly, I wish I had someone in the family who understands finance like you do sitting at the table with me. Your brain works in ways these corporate lawyers simply cannot comprehend. I could really use your informal perspective on some of our risk mitigation strategies." It was a brilliant textbook manipulation tactic. He was wrapping a highly dangerous hook in the soft, warm velvet of spousal flattery. He wanted to slowly acclimate me to the idea of my professional expertise brushing up against his corporate dealings. Simultaneously, Helena Voss launched a highly coordinated psychological ground campaign of her own. The woman who had previously treated me like invisible wallpaper suddenly decided we were intimate confidants. The aggressive friendliness was suffocating. It began with an unexpected delivery to my office on a Tuesday morning, an enormous, lavish arrangement of white orchids accompanied by a handwritten note on thick, embossed cardstock. She thanked me for sharing my brilliant husband with the firm during such a critical growth quarter. 2 days later, my personal cell phone rang at 8 o'clock in the morning. It was Helena, completely bypassing Adrian to speak directly to me. Her voice dripped with an artificial, sugary warmth as she officially invited me to serve as an honorary advisor for the Crown Meridian Corporate Charity Foundation. She insisted that they desperately needed my sharp analytical mind to help allocate their philanthropic grants. It was a calculated, invasive maneuver. She was intentionally blurring the strict boundaries of my personal life, attempting to disorient me by standing so close that I could not clearly see what her hands were doing. I played along flawlessly. I sent polite thank you emails. I feigned a gracious, modest hesitation regarding the charity board. I watched them build their trap, waiting for the exact moment they would make a fatal administrative error. That error materialized on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Adrian had spent the entire weekend pacing our home office, aggressively typing on his laptop and taking hushed, tense phone calls. When he finally stepped out to grab a coffee, leaving his laptop open and unattended on his mahogany desk, I walked in to water the ficus plant. The screen was glaringly bright, displaying a highly confidential draft of the capital funding dossier for the new hotel acquisition. I did not snoop through his emails or his text messages. I simply leaned forward and read the bold text on the open page. Under the section labeled Regulatory Compliance and Risk Mitigation, there was a specific line item detailing the oversight protocols for the loan dispersal. It clearly stated, Independent Reviewing Entity Right Ledger Advisory. A freezing, absolute silence descended over my mind. They had not merely stolen my husband, they had stolen my corporate identity. They had formally listed my highly respected firm as the independent auditor vetting their incredibly risky, heavily leveraged bridge loan. I had never signed a single contract with Crown Meridian. I had never reviewed a single piece of their financial data. They were using my pristine, bulletproof reputation in the financial sector to forcefully push a questionable loan past skeptical underwriters. When Adrian returned with his coffee, I was sitting calmly in the living room, reading a book. I waited exactly 2 hours before casually mentioning what I had seen. I kept my voice entirely neutral, simply asking why my company's name was printed in his internal loan documents. Adrian did not panic. He executed a flawless, well-rehearsed pivot. He let out a loud, patronizing chuckle, shaking his head as if I had just asked a remarkably foolish question. "Savannah, honey, please," he said, offering a condescending smile. "It is literally just placeholder text." The legal department needed to fill the blank space in the draft template so the formatting would not break during the printing phase. They just typed in the first consulting firm that popped into their heads because they know where you work. "We are contracting a massive firm out of New York for the actual audit next month." When I continued to stare at him, refusing to accept the absurd, legally impossible excuse, his smile instantly vanished. He shifted his weight, his posture turning aggressively defensive. "You are being incredibly sensitive about this," he snapped, his voice rising a fraction of a decibel. "You genuinely do not understand the pressure of the executive tier. We move fast. We use templates. You are turning a minor administrative formatting issue into a massive conspiracy because you are stressed. You really need to calm down." That was the exact moment the gaslighting officially began, having failed to quietly slip the fraud past me. They immediately initiated a scorched earth campaign to preemptively discredit my sanity. 3 days later, I attended a private networking luncheon hosted by the Regional Women in Finance Coalition. I was standing near the bar, sipping a glass of sparkling water, when a senior partner from a rival firm gently pulled me aside. She lowered her voice to a sympathetic whisper and placed a comforting hand on my arm. She told me that there was a very persistent, unfortunate rumor circulating through the corporate grapevine. The whisper campaign suggested that I was having an incredibly difficult time accepting my husband's rapid, spectacular success. The narrative being spun was that I was intensely jealous of his ascending star, that I was behaving erratically at home, and that my professional insecurities were actively creating unnecessary hurdles for his career. I smiled graciously, thanked her for her concern, and walked out of the luncheon with my spine perfectly straight. Helena and Adrian were meticulously laying the groundwork. If the fraudulent loan blew up and I attempted to blow the whistle, they had already planted the seeds to paint me as a bitter, hysterical, vindictive wife trying to destroy her successful husband out of pure spite. Adrian escalated the psychological warfare within the walls of our own home. He began treating me with a sickening, exaggerated fragility. If I misplaced my keys, he would sigh heavily and look at me with profound pity. If I asked a simple logistical question about his schedule, he would defensively claim I was interrogating him. One evening, while we were eating dinner in absolute silence, he reached across the table, took my hand, and looked deeply into my eyes with a masterclass display of fake concern. "Savannah," he whispered softly, "you have been so tense lately. You are imagining things. You are picking fights over formatting errors in my documents. I am genuinely worried about your mental health. I think you should seriously consider talking to a professional before your stress ruins everything we have built." The sheer audacity of his performance was breathtaking. He was staring directly into the eyes of the woman who built him from the ground up, attempting to convince her that she was losing her mind, all while he was actively forging her name on federal financial documents. The final fatal move came directly from Helena. She invited me to a private, extremely exclusive lunch at a country club just outside the city limits. After we finished our salads, she reached into her designer handbag and produced a sleek, blue legal folder. She slid it across the white linen tablecloth with a warm, encouraging smile. It was a spousal acknowledgement form. "It is just a silly, harmless little formality for the bank," Helena lied effortlessly, her dark eyes entirely unblinking. Because the bridge loan structure is so complex, the underwriters are requiring standard spousal waivers from all the senior executives regarding their primary residences. It just reassures the creditors that our key players have stable domestic foundations. Adrian was too stressed to bring it up, so I offered to handle it for him. Just sign at the bottom, darling. I looked down at the paper. It was a legally binding document that would explicitly attach our jointly owned $3 million townhouse as collateral against the corporate debt of Crown Meridian. If the loan defaulted, the bank could seize my home. They were not just trying to use my professional reputation. They were actively trying to steal the roof over my head to secure their fraudulent money. I did not scream. I did not throw my glass of iced tea in her face. I did not even refuse to sign it. I simply smiled, folded the document neatly in half, and slipped it directly into my purse. I told her I had a strict, uncompromising policy of letting my personal attorney review every single contract I signed, no matter how trivial. I watched the brief, terrifying flash of panic ignite in Helena's eyes before she quickly masked it with a tight smile. I drove home in total silence. I walked into my house, bypassed the kitchen entirely, and went straight to my home office. I did not shed a single tear. I did not mourn the death of my marriage. I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I pulled the spousal acknowledgement form from my purse and placed it perfectly flat on my desk. I turned on the overhead lights. I took out my phone and meticulously photographed every single page, capturing the crisp, undeniable reality of their intent. I photographed the drafts. I photographed the emails. I recorded the exact timestamps of every interaction. I stopped being a wife completely. I became a weapon, and I began preparing for war. Most betrayed spouses hire private investigators to sit in unmarked sedans, drinking terrible coffee and taking grainy, humiliating photographs through telephoto lenses. I did not need a man in a trench coat to tell me my husband was a liar. I only needed a forgotten piece of hardware, a secure internet connection, and my intimate, professional understanding of digital forensic accounting. People lie with effortless grace. Spreadsheets can be manipulated to tell incredibly convincing fairy tales. But the metadata embedded within a digital file does not possess the capacity for deception. It is the absolute, unvarnished truth of the corporate world. I began my investigation with an older generation tablet that Adrian had abandoned in the bottom drawer of his nightstand roughly 8 months ago. He had complained loudly that the battery life was degrading and immediately purchased a newer model on the company expense account. He left the old device completely forgotten beneath a pile of unused charging cables and old travel adapters. More importantly, in his typical careless fashion, he had forgotten to wipe the local cache or log out of his synchronized cloud storage accounts. I waited until he left for a mandatory weekend golf retreat with the regional vice presidents. I took the dusty tablet into my secure home office, locked the heavy oak door, and plugged it into a dedicated power source. I did not connect the device to our standard home wireless network. Instead, I tethered it to an encrypted virtual private network routed through a secure server in Switzerland. I had to ensure that his current devices would not receive a sudden, fatal security ping alerting him that a secondary machine was actively downloading his entire digital history. It took me exactly 14 minutes to definitively prove that my husband was sleeping with his chief executive officer. The evidence of their physical affair was glaringly mundane and entirely pathetic. I found localized tracking data tagging his device at a luxury boutique hotel downtown on Tuesday afternoons. During the exact hours his shared calendar claimed he was attending executive wellness seminars. I recovered digital receipts for expensive midday room service billed directly to a secondary. Hidden credit card. I found buried. Encrypted chat logs that were so incredibly cliché they were genuinely embarrassing to read. I sat back in my leather chair and stared intently at the glowing screen, absorbing the irrefutable proof of his infidelity. My pulse did not elevate by a single beat. My eyes remained completely dry. The affair was nothing more than a cheap, predictable symptom of arrogance. It was a sloppy, highly emotional vulnerability. However, my professional instincts immediately recognized that the affair was merely a poorly constructed facade. It was the shiny distraction hiding a much more sinister, deeply structural rot. I swiftly bypassed the sordid details of their hotel rendezvous and focused entirely on the metadata of his downloaded corporate files. I began pulling down the archived .raw versions of the presentation decks and budget proposals for the massive hotel acquisition they were trying to refinance. That is when the true, terrifying scale of the betrayal finally crystallized before my eyes. I noticed a distinct, aggressive pattern of capital bleeding hidden underneath incredibly vague operational categories. There were massive recurring payments authorized for generic services labeled as brand development, strategic market consulting, and exclusive high net worth guest experiences. I traced the routing numbers on the approved invoices. The money was being systematically siphoned out of the operating budget of Crown Meridian and funneled directly into two distinct, highly suspicious corporate entities, North Key Events and Blue Aster Consulting. I pulled the public state registry filings for both companies. North Key Events was incorporated exactly 6 months ago. The registered agent on the public filing was a man named Julian. Julian was Adrian's former fraternity brother from his undergraduate years at the university. Julian currently managed a moderately successful, sticky-floored sports bar. He was completely and utterly unqualified to provide high-level corporate hospitality consulting to a massive luxury conglomerate. Blue Aster Consulting was a significantly darker, more sophisticated entity. The registration bypassed local, transparent jurisdictions entirely. The corporate trail linked directly to a boutique law firm notorious for constructing impenetrable financial labyrinths across 3 different states, specifically designed to shield hidden assets from federal tax authorities. They were not just having a workplace romance, they were actively embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars. I watched the digital fingerprints of the fraud unfold chronologically on my screen. I tracked the life cycle of a single transaction. Adrian would receive a legitimate, standard invoice for $25,000 for a regional corporate retreat. The system logs showed the file being opened, modified, and saved on his local machine. The newly forged invoice, now demanding $150,000, would be routed directly to Helena's private inbox. The approval signatures were a masterpiece of administrative manipulation. The metadata proved that Helena was signing off on these massively inflated approvals at 2 o'clock in the morning. She would send the encrypted approval back to Adrian via email. Then, Adrian's administrative login was being used to manually bypass the system locks and backdate the entry into the corporate ledger. They were forcing the system to record the transaction as if it had cleared the standard 30-day compliance window perfectly normally. A cold, heavy knot formed at the base of my stomach. The phantom vendors and the inflated invoices were certainly enough to send both of them to federal prison. But that was just standard corporate theft. The detail that made the blood literally freeze in my veins was the underlying architecture of the massive bridge loan itself. I cross-referenced the fraudulent revenue projections they were building with the exact draft of the loan application I had seen on his laptop days prior. The sheer volume of the fabricated income they were using to secure the refinancing was astronomical. If the underwriters or a genuine auditing firm ever scrutinized the raw data, the entire deal would instantly collapse under the weight of its own fictional numbers. That was the exact moment the final, devastating puzzle piece snapped violently into place. That was precisely why my consulting firm's name had been quietly slipped into the regulatory compliance paperwork. If the deal exploded after the massive funds were dispersed, the creditors would launch a relentless investigation. When the auditors finally arrived and demanded to know how such grossly inflated projections had ever been legally approved, Adrian and Helena needed a bulletproof shield to absorb the impact. They were meticulously setting the stage to point directly at the legally binding loan documents that listed Right Ledger Advisory as the independent reviewing entity. "Just placeholder text," he had told me with a condescending smile. It was never a placeholder. It was a perfectly laid trap. They were going to claim that I had personally vetted the numbers. They would argue that I was fully aware of the corporate structuring, and that I had used my pristine, industry-leading reputation to rubber stamp their massive fraud. If I tried to deny it, they would point to the spousal acknowledgement form Helena had tried to force me to sign, using it to claim I was heavily involved in securing the financial collateral. They were going to feed me to the wolves to save their own lucrative careers. I gently closed the cover of the old tablet. The silence in my office was absolute. I finally understood the terrifying reality of my situation. This was no longer a rotting marriage rapidly heading toward a messy divorce. This was an active financial crime scene. I was not the tragic, emotionally devastated wife. I was the designated scapegoat. I was the meat shield they fully intended to sacrifice when their magnificent empire inevitably burned to the ground. They believed they were incredibly clever, playing a high-stakes game of corporate theft while keeping the naive, trusting spouse completely in the dark. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the dynamic of our entire relationship. Adrian did not build his own success. I engineered every single step of it. I knew exactly how his professional foundation was poured, and I knew exactly where all the load-bearing walls were located, and what I painstakingly engineer. I can absolutely dismantle without leaving a single trace of my involvement. I needed a weapon perfectly disguised as a legal counselor. I retained Inez Holloway. Inez was a terrifyingly sharp, profoundly cynical litigation attorney who operated out of a brutalist office building downtown. She charged $1,200 an hour and famously rarely spoke more than 3 consecutive sentences in a single client meeting. She did not waste precious billable time offering me useless maternal sympathy or pushing a box of soft tissues across her desk. When I slid the printed photographs of the manipulated corporate ledgers, the forged vendor invoices, and the draft of the fraudulent loan application across her massive, immaculate glass desk, she simply adjusted her heavy reading glasses. She reviewed the documents in absolute silence for exactly 4 minutes. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was entirely devoid of pity. "How surgically do you want to remove them from your life?" she asked, her voice sounding like dry gravel. I looked directly into her cold eyes and told her I absolutely did not want surgery. I wanted a complete, highly controlled demolition. Our first offensive maneuver had to be completely invisible. Within 48 hours of that initial meeting, Inez and I systematically severed every single financial artery connecting my personal, hard-earned wealth to my husband's potentially toxic, criminal liabilities. I quietly and efficiently transferred the entirety of my firm's operational capital, my personal investment portfolios, and my retirement funds into newly established, heavily encrypted accounts shielded by airtight trusts. We executed aggressive legal directives immediately revoking any implied or direct spousal permissions Adrian might attempt to leverage if he suddenly needed liquidity to hire a criminal defense attorney. If the federal regulatory authorities eventually raided his office and froze his assets, they would slam directly into my financial borders, which were now fortified with impenetrable legal concrete. I purposefully left just enough funds in our shared domestic checking account to seamlessly cover the monthly utilities, the grocery deliveries, and the mortgage on the townhouse. To anyone monitoring the surface, our domestic financial life looked perfectly undisturbed. Defense, however, was merely the baseline requirement for survival. I required active, devastating leverage. I reached out to a former corporate client, a highly discreet, brilliant operative working deep within the murky sector of special distressed credit. Through a beautifully encrypted, highly coded 5-minute phone call, he provided me with a golden, explosive piece of market intelligence. The massive bridge loan Crown Meridian was so desperately attempting to secure was composed of multiple financial layers. One of the subordinate lenders, a mid-sized private equity firm feeling extremely nervous about the aggressive nature of the hotel restructuring, was actively, quietly looking to offload their portion of the debt at a steep 25% discount just to clear their books before the financial quarter ended. It was an opportunity too exquisite to ignore. Working aggressively through Inez, I rapidly established a perfectly opaque, legally blind corporate entity registered in the state of Delaware. I named it Red Orchard Holdings, operating exclusively through this ghost corporation. I quietly purchased the rights to that specific tranche of the subordinate debt. Acquiring this fraction of the debt absolutely did not make me the owner of the hotel empire. It did not give me a seat on the executive board. What it granted me, however, was infinitely more lethal. It gave me absolute covenant control. As a legally recognized debt holder on the pending massive loan, I now possess the absolute contractual right to instantly halt the entire financial transaction if I discovered that the borrowing party had supplied falsified revenue projections, or more importantly, had misrepresented the identity of their independent reviewing entity. I had essentially purchased the detonator to the bomb they were building under my name, with the massive, invisible trap perfectly laid. I needed to ensure the right people were looking in the exact right direction when it finally snapped shut. I assembled a highly curated, entirely emotionless package of printed documents. I deliberately did not include any passionate, messy accusations of infidelity, nor did I make any dramatic, overarching claims of grand embezzlement. I simply compiled a series of stark, undeniable mathematical anomalies regarding the recent, highly inflated vendor approvals for North Quay Events and Blue Aster Consulting. I drafted a dry, extremely polite cover letter containing 4 highly specific, deeply technical questions regarding the current compliance oversight protocols. I sent this package via a secure, untraceable courier directly to the private, gated residence of Malcolm Reed. Malcolm was the famously rigid, deeply conservative, incredibly wealthy chairman of the Crown Meridian Audit Committee. I knew Malcolm's reputation perfectly. He would never simply ignore a legitimate, mathematically proven financial discrepancy, especially one delivered with such chilling, anonymous precision. I planted the seed of suspicion in the one mind they could not easily manipulate. He could not pretend he had never seen those numbers. Furthermore, I needed absolute, physical assurance that the digital evidence I had uncovered would not miraculously disappear when the panic inevitably started and the corporate hard drives were mysteriously wiped. I tracked down the junior internal controller whose digital signature had been forcefully overridden to push the backdated, fraudulent invoices into the accounting system. He was a pale, exhausted 26-year-old kid, absolutely terrified that he was going to go to federal prison for a massive crime his wealthy superiors had committed. I arranged a highly discreet, off-the-record meeting in a quiet, poorly lit coffee shop on the industrial edge of the city. I did not threaten him. I did not raise my voice. I simply bought him a black coffee and calmly explained the precise, terrifying legal difference between being indicted as an active co-conspirator and being protected as a cooperative federal witness. I instructed him to quietly, methodically export the original, unedited financial files, the raw server access logs, and the specific, damning email chains containing the backdate orders directly from Helena's office into a secure, encrypted offline drive. I told him to hold on to that small, plastic drive as if his actual life depended on it. Because it did. He nodded furiously, his hands shaking so violently he spilled half of his coffee onto the wooden table, while the invisible noose tightened rapidly and securely around their necks. I maintained the perfect, agonizing illusion of the fading, oblivious wife. I continued to dutifully attend their tedious, extravagant corporate dinners and charity galas. I sat quietly next to Adrian at long, candlelit tables, wearing my carefully selected, conservative dresses. I sipped my sparkling water, ate my roasted salmon, and offered nothing but polite, slightly vacuous smiles to his aggressive colleagues. I deliberately projected the aura of a woman who was slowly, sadly being defeated by her husband's overwhelming, blinding success. I played the role of the insecure spouse desperately trying to maintain a shred of quiet dignity while being entirely out of her depth. It was the most challenging, exhausting performance of my entire life. But it yielded spectacular, fatal results. My absolute lack of resistance, my refusal to argue or throw tantrums, made Adrian profoundly arrogant. He genuinely believed he had successfully managed my brief, hysterical suspicions. Helena, completely misreading my calculated silence as pathetic submission, grew increasingly bold, sloppy, and careless in her administrative shortcuts. They were so incredibly focused on congratulating themselves for their own brilliance, so busy anticipating their imminent wealth, that they never once stopped to consider why the ground beneath their feet had suddenly become so perfectly, unnervingly still. They mistook my silence for victory, completely unaware that it was simply the sound of the air being violently sucked out of the room right before the explosion. He chose a remarkably pretentious, wildly overpriced French bistro located in the most affluent historic district of the city for our Sunday brunch. It was exactly 11 o'clock in the morning. The sunlight filtered beautifully through the canopy of ancient oak trees, casting soft, dappled shadows across the pristine white linen tablecloths. It was the kind of idyllic, perfectly curated environment one typically reserves for celebrating a major life milestone or a romantic anniversary. Adrian, however, had specifically chosen this highly public, elegant setting to formally terminate our marriage. He wore a lightweight, expertly tailored navy linen suit and a crisp white shirt unbuttoned perfectly at the collar. He looked incredibly handsome, perfectly rested, and entirely unburdened by guilt. He ordered a $40 plate of truffled eggs and a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. I ordered black coffee. Before our expensive meals even arrived at the table, he reached into his sleek leather briefcase and casually produced a thick, heavy ivory envelope. He did not look down at the table in shame. He did not stumble over his words or offer any insincere, tearful apologies. He slid the heavy envelope across the white linen, directly past the silver salt shaker, and looked me squarely in the eyes. He performed the action with the exact same detached, professional efficiency he would use when handing a final invoice to a vendor whose contract had just expired. "Savannah," he began, his voice perfectly modulated, smooth, and utterly devoid of genuine emotion. "We are both highly logical, career-driven adults. We both know that this arrangement is no longer yielding positive results for either of us. I think it is time we transition out of this phase of our lives." I stared at the envelope. I did not reach for it. I simply let it sit there, a physical manifestation of his extraordinary arrogance. He was actually using corporate management terminology to describe the end of a 7-year marriage. "Inside that envelope is a finalized settlement agreement," he continued, leaning back comfortably in his chair and steepling his fingers. "I had my attorneys draft it to be as clean and painless as possible. I am asking for an extremely quiet, uncontested dissolution. More importantly, there is a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement attached to the primary filing. I need your absolute legal guarantee that you will not discuss our private domestic matters with anyone in our professional network. I am stepping into the defining moment of my entire career this quarter. I simply cannot afford any unnecessary public relations distractions." I picked up my porcelain cup and took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. "A non-disclosure agreement," I repeated flatly. "You want me to sign a gag order?" Adrian offered a tight, patronizing smile, the kind of smile a tired teacher gives a particularly slow student. "It is standard executive procedure. Savannah, it protects both of us. And honestly, it is highly beneficial for you." Helena and I had a long conversation about how to handle this gracefully. She is an incredibly sophisticated woman, and she genuinely wants to see you land on your feet. She suggested a very generous severance package. The sheer audacity of the statement hung in the air, toxic and heavy. My husband was casually relaying divorce settlement advice from his mistress, referring to my alimony as a severance package. "If you sign the paperwork by Friday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon," Adrian explained smoothly, "I am prepared to offer you a lump sum cash settlement of $400,000. I will also transfer the deed to a very nice, newly renovated 2-bedroom condominium located on the north side of the city. You get a fresh start, a clean break, and you walk away in total peace. It is a golden parachute. You would be incredibly foolish to fight it." He paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Before his tone shifted from patronizing to distinctly threatening, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his handsome face hardening. "If you do not sign it, Savannah, things will get remarkably unpleasant for you. If you try to make a scene, if you try to drag this out in court or ruin my reputation out of spite, the narrative will not favor you. People in our industry already whisper about you. They already think you are unstable, wildly jealous, and deeply resentful of my success. If you fight this generous offer, everyone will simply see a bitter, hysterical woman desperately trying to destroy a highly successful man because she could not keep up with his trajectory. Do not embarrass yourself. Just sign the paperwork and let me move on with my life." He was perfectly executing the gaslighting campaign they had so meticulously planned. He genuinely believed he had backed me into a completely inescapable corner, forcing me to choose between a quiet, humiliating surrender and a highly public, destructive character assassination. Right at that exact second, my personal cell phone vibrated sharply against my thigh. I broke eye contact with Adrian and casually slipped the phone out of my purse, keeping it below the edge of the table. It was a highly encrypted, automated alert from the secure digital Dropbox I had established with the terrified junior controller I had flipped days earlier. The subject line of the incoming file was completely blank. I opened the attachment. It was a highly classified, heavily restricted internal human resources memorandum. The metadata attached to the file indicated it had been drafted directly from the private terminal in Helena Voss's executive suite exactly 48 hours ago. It was fully prepared, legally vetted, and simply waiting for a final signature to be executed. I read the text of the memorandum while Adrian casually picked up his fork and began eating his truffled eggs. The document was a masterpiece of corporate survival. It was a preemptive legal firewall designed to completely insulate the chief executive officer from federal indictment. The memorandum explicitly stated that, upon an internal routine review, it had come to the attention of the executive board that Vice President Adrian Blake had severely bypassed standard compliance protocols. It detailed, with terrifying precision, that Adrian had unilaterally, without any executive oversight or authorization, approved all the fraudulent vendor invoices for North Key Events and Blue Aster Consulting. Furthermore, the document claimed that Adrian had completely fabricated the independent reviewing credentials of Right Ledger Advisory to aggressively push his own rogue agenda regarding the bridge loan. The meaning of the document was absolute and undeniable. Helena had built a customized, perfectly tailored coffin for the man sitting across from me. She had no intention of marrying him, elevating him, or ruling her empire alongside him. The second the federal auditors flagged the massive financial discrepancies in the loan application, she was going to activate this memorandum, hand it directly to the authorities, and watch Adrian take the entire fall. He was not the powerful king on the chessboard. He was just a highly attractive, entirely disposable pawn. He was the designated scapegoat. I looked up from my phone screen and stared at my husband. He was chewing his expensive food, looking out the restaurant window at the passing luxury cars, looking completely and utterly victorious. He was so blindingly arrogant, so deeply convinced of his own brilliance and his new lover's loyalty, that he could not see the massive guillotine suspended just inches above his neck. In that highly specific, frozen moment in time, I experienced a violent, entirely unexpected internal conflict. For exactly 3 seconds, the deeply buried ghost of the woman who had genuinely loved him, the woman who had spent 5 years tirelessly building his career and supporting his dreams, violently surfaced in my chest. I felt a sudden, sickening wave of pure pity. No matter how cruel, how arrogant, or how unfaithful he had become, no human being deserved to be led to a slaughterhouse while completely blindfolded and smiling. I opened my mouth. The impulse to warn him, to show him the digital file, to shatter his delusions and tell him to run to a criminal defense attorney immediately, was overwhelming. But then, the cold, undeniable facts of the ledger crashed back into my consciousness. I did not remember the man who used to make me coffee in the morning. I remembered the man who casually asked me how to penetrate my company's legal defenses. I remembered the man who aggressively tried to leverage my pristine professional reputation to secure a fraudulent loan. I remembered the man who stood in my kitchen and tried to convince me I was losing my mind, just so he could steal the townhouse I bought with my own money. I remembered the man who had just looked me in the eye and threatened to publicly brand me as an unstable, hysterical woman if I did not quietly accept my own disposal. The sudden rush of empathy instantly died, turning into cold, hard ash in my chest. I realized that saving him would be the ultimate betrayal of myself. He had actively chosen his path. He had actively chosen his mentor. He had actively chosen the exact weapon that was about to destroy him. I slowly placed my phone back into my purse. I reached across the table, placed my hand firmly on the heavy ivory envelope containing my heavily discounted worth, and pulled it toward me. I will have my attorney review the settlement structure and the non-disclosure agreement, I said, my voice completely smooth and dangerously calm. I am sure we can reach a very swift, very definitive conclusion. Adrian smiled broadly, clearly incredibly relieved that I had folded so quickly. I knew you would see reason, Savannah. It really is for the best. I offered him a very small, utterly empty smile in return. I did not say another word. I simply sat there and watched him finish his breakfast, allowing him to enjoy his final, pathetic illusion of control, fully prepared to let him learn the ultimate lesson in corporate loyalty from the exact woman he had chosen over me. The grand anniversary gala of Crown Meridian Hospitality at the Halcyon Crest was not merely an annual celebration of corporate endurance. It was a heavily choreographed theatrical production meticulously designed to project an absolute illusion of unstoppable financial momentum for Helena Voss and Adrian Blake. This specific Friday evening was the ultimate culmination of their grand, arrogant design. They planned to publicly announce the successful closing of the massive refinancing package, an announcement immediately followed by the formal, spectacular elevation of Adrian to the executive board. He was about to be crowned the youngest senior executive in the entire history of the conglomerate. They were excitedly preparing a glittering coronation. I, however, was quietly preparing a flawlessly timed execution. The pacing of my days rapidly accelerated, shifting from slow, careful observation into rapid, clinical action. Every single gear of my trap had to lock firmly into its exact position before the very first bottle of vintage champagne was uncorked. Inside the sterile, freezing gray conference room of Inez Holloway's law firm, we spent 48 consecutive hours refining the absolute perfect kill switch. Through Red Orchard Holdings, the highly secretive ghost entity we established to purchase the subordinate debt, I now wielded absolute covenant control over their incoming capital. Inez and I drafted a formal, legally devastating notice of loan default. This specific legal instrument was a financial death warrant. It clearly cited catastrophic misrepresentation of independent auditing entities and severe violations of the fiduciary trust agreement. However, we could not simply fire the weapon blindly into the dark. The trap was strictly conditional. The notice of default would only become legally binding and catastrophically explosive if and only if Crown Meridian officially executed and submitted the finalized, fraudulent loan dossier to the lead creditors that very night. We needed them to cross the final, irreversible threshold of federal fraud. We needed them to proudly claim their fake numbers in ink. Simultaneously, my anonymous package to Malcolm Reed had successfully detonated behind the heavy, closed doors of the executive board. The deeply conservative, notoriously rigid chairman of the audit committee did not dismiss the stark mathematical anomalies I had sent him. Through highly encrypted back channels, my contact in the distressed credit sector confirmed that Malcolm was quietly mobilizing his own severe countermeasures. He had explicitly refused to sign off on the preliminary Gala press release earlier that morning. More importantly, he had officially requested additional seating for the evening. Malcolm was not bringing his wife or a social companion. He had arranged for a ruthless outside special counsel and a highly aggressive independent forensic data analyst to attend the glittering event, perfectly disguised as silent, observant investors. The jury was already seated in the room, and Helena had absolutely no idea they were actively breathing in her courtroom. On Wednesday afternoon, exactly 48 hours before the gala, the terrified junior internal controller delivered the final, fatal piece of ammunition. A heavily encrypted digital drive arrived at my office via a blind, untraceable courier. It contained the absolute holy grail of digital forensics, the raw, unadulterated metadata of the finalized loan application. The internal routing logs painted an undeniable, deeply damning picture. The final modifications to the document, specifically, the fraudulent insertion of my firm's name as the independent reviewing entity and the massive, fictional inflation of the revenue projections, did not originate from the neutral, legally compliant computers of the corporate legal department. The digital fingerprints proved beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that the file had been manually altered on the private, highly restricted terminal located directly inside the executive suite belonging to Helena Voss. It completely bypassed every single internal security protocol. There was zero plausible deniability left. Helena could not blame a rogue junior analyst or a clerical error. Her own digital signature was firmly and permanently pressed against the murder weapon. I sat at my sleek office desk and compiled the raw data into a master narrative timeline that was breathtaking in its cruelty and mathematical precision. I stripped away all the messy human emotion, leaving only cold, hard chronological facts. I documented the exact day the hotel rendezvous began. I mapped the precise hour the fake vendors, North Key Events and Blue Aster Consulting, were officially incorporated into the corporate supply chain. I highlighted the exact minute the name of Right Ledger Advisory was fraudulently inserted into the regulatory compliance drafts. Finally, I attached the digital timestamp of the Sunday brunch where my husband aggressively attempted to force me to sign a non-disclosure agreement while handing me a finalized divorce settlement. It was a perfectly straight, undeniable line connecting his cheap infidelity directly to their massive federal embezzlement. To ensure absolute, undeniable mutual destruction, I programmed a dead man's switch on my secure server. I scheduled a staggered series of automated emails containing the entire timeline, the raw metadata, and the photographic evidence of the spousal acknowledgement form. If the financial transaction crossed the final fraud threshold at 8 o'clock that evening, the emails would simultaneously blast directly to my professional liability insurance carrier to protect my firm, the lead counsel for the primary lending syndicate, and 2 highly skeptical members of the Crown Meridian Board of Directors. The corrupt system would completely burn to the ground whether I was physically standing in the room or not. When the evening of the gala finally arrived, my physical transformation was absolute and deliberate. For weeks, I had carefully played the pathetic part of the fading, exhausted, oblivious spouse, wearing dull colors and maintaining a hunched, defeated posture. Tonight required a completely different type of armor. I bypassed the brightly colored, overly elaborate gowns hanging in my spacious closet. A woman who is desperately trying to win back her cheating husband wears bright red silk and heavy, sparkling jewelry to scream for his fleeting attention. I was no longer a woman who needed to be noticed, liked, or even believed. I possessed the hard, irrefutable documentation that would violently force the world to believe me regardless of my demeanor. I chose a severe, floor-length black dress with sharp architectural lines and absolutely zero embellishments. It was stark, unyielding, and completely devoid of warmth or vulnerability. I pulled my hair back into a tight, sharp style. I applied minimal makeup. I looked exactly like an executioner arriving on time for a strictly scheduled appointment. Adrian's sheer, impenetrable blindness in those final hours was genuinely staggering to witness. As I descended the staircase of our townhouse, he was waiting in the grand foyer, casually adjusting his expensive silk bow tie in the large gilded mirror. He looked at my stark black dress and offered a patronizing, approving nod. He actually had the absolute audacity to thank me for coming. Earlier that week, after I had vaguely agreed to let my attorney review his insulting divorce settlement, he had specifically requested my presence at this grand gala. "Savannah, it really means a lot to me that you are willing to do this," he had said, standing in our kitchen with a completely straight face, entirely unburdened by guilt. "It shows incredible class. We need to demonstrate to the board, and to Helena, that we are two highly mature adults handling our transition with grace. It makes everyone comfortable. Tonight is the biggest leap of my life, and having you there as a supportive, silent partner just seals the perfect optic for my promotion." He genuinely believed I was walking into the Halcyon Crest Hotel to quietly stand in the shadows and validate his magnificent, stolen victory. He completely thought I was gracefully bowing out of his life so he could confidently step into the dazzling, lucrative spotlight Helena had prepared for him. He had absolutely no idea that the spotlight was heavily wired. The stage was entirely rigged with legal explosives, and the woman walking silently beside him held the match that would permanently incinerate his entire universe. Every single gear was locked into place. The trap was set perfectly. All I had to do was walk into the glittering ballroom and calmly wait for them to proudly hand me the detonator. The ballroom of the Halcyon Crest Hotel was a masterclass in aggressive opulence. Golden light cascaded down from 3 massive crystal chandeliers, refracting violently through hundreds of heavy champagne flutes. A 12-piece jazz ensemble played a smooth, rhythmic set in the far corner, but their music was entirely drowned out by the deafening, chaotic roar of high-net-worth networking. The evening began with a relentless barrage of hollow, agonizingly tedious corporate speeches. Fatigued men in bespoke Italian suits took turns standing at the mahogany podium, loudly regurgitating empty buzzwords like exponential growth, strategic brand repositioning, and the limitless potential of our shared future. It was a perfectly choreographed dance of wealth and deception, designed to blind the investors to the massive financial crater opening directly beneath their feet. Helena Voss had personally orchestrated every microscopic detail of the evening, and my assigned seating arrangement was her ultimate, silent declaration of war. I was absolutely not placed at the sprawling, flower-draped executive table in the dead center of the room. I was not even seated within speaking distance of my own husband. Instead, I found my elegantly calligraphed place card resting on a small, cramped table situated immediately next to the heavily trafficked swinging kitchen doors. I was surrounded by junior supply vendors, completely confused +1s, and the profoundly bored spouses of middle management. The physical distance between my chair and the main stage was roughly 80 feet, but in the brutal, unforgiving geography of corporate society, it might as well have been an entirely different continent. It was a highly calculated, deeply personal insult, precisely designed to physically manifest my complete irrelevance in their new world order. They wanted me to look at the glittering stage from the humiliating perspective of a peasant. Adrian, meanwhile, floated effortlessly through the golden room in his immaculate black tuxedo. He was completely in his element. He absorbed the premature congratulations from the senior equity partners with a sickeningly modest smile, shaking hands and firmly clasping shoulders. Whenever his eyes accidentally swept across the vast room and met mine, his gaze slid right past me without a single micro-expression of recognition. He treated me exactly like an unfortunate ink stain on a brilliant, newly printed resume. I was a minor fading blemish he was literally hours away from completely erasing from his permanent record. I sat perfectly still, holding a glass of sparkling water, letting the intended humiliation wash completely over me without absorbing a single, solitary drop of it. My eyes systematically scanned the glittering crowd, ignoring the wealthy donors and the desperate socialites. I was strictly looking for the anomalies. I found them standing quietly near the perimeter of the room, far away from the flashing cameras. Malcolm Reed, the deeply conservative chairman of the audit committee, was absolutely not smiling. He stood near a towering ice sculpture, his expression incredibly grim, holding a glass of scotch he never actually brought to his lips. Beside him stood a woman wearing a severe gray suit, whom I immediately recognized as the ruthless outside special counsel he had retained, and lingering just a few feet away from them, projecting an aura of complete, unyielding silence, was the representative for the primary lending syndicate. They did not mingle. They did not laugh. They simply watched the executives celebrate with the terrifying, absolute stillness of executioners waiting for the final bell to ring. Halfway through the main course of roasted duck and wild mushroom risotto, the jazz music faded away, and Helena Voss confidently took the stage. She wore a stunning crimson silk gown that moved like liquid fire, commanding the massive room with effortless, terrifying gravity. She raised a crystal glass high into the air and delivered a breathless, passionate toast dedicated to the aggressive expansion of the Crown Meridian Empire. She spoke loudly about unwavering loyalty, the sheer courage required to discard outdated models, and the absolute audacity of the new generation of corporate leadership. As she deliberately spoke the words, "new generation," she purposefully turned her head and let her dark, predatory gaze rest heavily on Adrian. It was a lingering, deeply possessive look, entirely inappropriate for a chief executive to publicly direct at a married subordinate. It was just intimate enough to make the surrounding investors chuckle knowingly. She was intentionally allowing everyone in the room to misinterpret her gaze in the exact, scandalous direction she desired. She was publicly marking her territory, feeding the rumors, and establishing his position as her chosen successor and partner. As the loud applause echoed through the room, and the catering staff began clearing the heavy china plates, Helena gracefully stepped down from the stage. She bypassed the executives and glided directly across the floor toward my peripheral table near the kitchen. "Savannah," she said smoothly, her voice carrying just enough volume for the surrounding vendors to hear her apparent kindness. "It is entirely too loud and chaotic in here. Why do we not step out into the conservatory for a moment? Let us have a quiet drink and talk like two mature women." I stood up without saying a single word. I followed her out of the noisy ballroom and into the glass-enclosed botanical conservatory attached to the outdoor terrace. The air inside the glass room was cool, thick, and heavy with the scent of blooming night jasmine and wet earth. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind us, completely silencing the jazz band and the roaring crowd. Away from her adoring audience, the sophisticated, polite facade instantly vanished. Her posture hardened, her shoulders squared, and her dark eyes locked onto mine with raw, undisguised contempt. She did not offer me a drink. "We are going to make this incredibly simple," Helena stated, her tone sharp and entirely devoid of any artificial warmth. "Adrian gave you the settlement papers this morning. I highly suggest you sign them tonight before this gala concludes. If you agree to a quiet, immediate retreat, you get to keep a very handsome sum of money, a beautiful little condo on the north side, and whatever remains of your fragile dignity." She took a slow, deliberate step closer to me, attempting to invade my physical space, trying to use her height and her perceived power to force me to shrink back against the glass wall. I did not move a single fraction of an inch. "Do not be pathetic, Savannah," she continued, her voice dripping with venomous, manufactured pity. "Do not try to desperately cling to a man who has clearly outgrown your limited capacity. You were a stepping stone, and your purpose has been fulfilled. He chose a much larger future. He chose me. If you try to fight this, or if you attempt to cause a scene to ruin his grand promotion tonight, I will personally ensure that your little financial consulting firm is permanently blacklisted by every major hospitality conglomerate on the East Coast. You will lose your husband, your home, and your entire career by Monday morning. Take the graceful exit." Helena then leaned in so close that the expensive, heavy citrus notes of her perfume were absolutely suffocating. She lowered her head slightly. Her voice dropped to a soft, incredibly dangerous register. It sounded as smooth as velvet but felt as filthy and toxic as used engine oil. "Let us spend the evening together," she whispered. It was absolutely not a friendly invitation to share a drink or find common ground. It was a direct, terrifying command to step into a dirty, humiliating arrangement. It was the final ultimatum from a predator demanding that I sit quietly in the dark and officially accept my own permanent erasure from their magnificent new world. I did not take a single step backward. The thick, humid air of the glass conservatory pressed heavily against my bare shoulders, carrying the cloying scent of wet orchids and Helena's suffocating perfume. Any other woman standing in my precise position would have undoubtedly swallowed the venomous emotional bait Helena had just so expertly cast into the dark water. The expected script dictated that I should tremble. I was supposed to flush with a deep, humiliating shade of red. I was supposed to demand, with a cracked and fragile voice, exactly how many months she had been sleeping with my husband. I was supposed to ask if she loved him, or if he loved her, or if any of the late nights at the office were ever actually real. I asked her absolutely nothing. I completely ignored the pathetic, sordid reality of their physical affair because, in the grand, cold architecture of this specific evening, their romance was the absolute least interesting thing about them. It was merely the sloppy, careless error that had allowed me to audit their entire lives. I maintained absolute, unblinking eye contact with the chief executive officer of Crown Meridian. I let the heavy silence stretch out between us. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I watched the supreme, arrogant confidence in her dark eyes slowly begin to curdle into something closely resembling mild annoyance. She was a woman who demanded immediate reactions, and my absolute stillness was a foreign language she did not know how to translate. Right at that exact, crystalline moment, the heavy silence was punctured by a sharp, singular vibration against my right thigh. I smoothly broke our eye contact, reached into my small black evening bag, and withdrew my phone. I did not attempt to hide the screen from her. I simply glanced down at the bright, glowing notification illuminating the dim botanical shadows. It was a secure text message from Inez Holloway. The message contained exactly 3 short words. It is done. The final. Massive financial tumbler had just violently clicked into place. The secondary lending syndicate had officially executed the transfer of the subordinate debt. Red Orchard Holdings was no longer a silent ghost hovering in the digital ether. It was now a heavily armed, legally recognized creditor holding the absolute power of financial life and death over the entire luxury hotel conglomerate. The weapon was fully loaded, the safety was off, and my finger was resting gently on the trigger. I slowly slid the phone back into my small silk purse until the clasp snapped shut with a sharp, definitive click. I lifted my chin and looked back at Helena. I looked at her for a very long time. I looked at her long enough for the mild annoyance in her eyes to fracture, giving way to a sudden, highly uncomfortable realization that she was no longer controlling the pace or the direction of this conversation. She was standing in her own expensive hotel, wearing a dress that cost more than a luxury vehicle. Yet she suddenly looked entirely unmoored. "Actually," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any anger, sorrow, or hesitation. "I would rather spend it with the people who now hold your debt." Helena physically froze. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely involuntary. Her breath hitched in her throat, halting for half of a beat. But then, the deeply ingrained survival instincts of a seasoned corporate predator violently kicked back in. The moment of genuine shock was instantly paved over by a tight, highly patronizing smirk. She let out a soft, dismissive breath that was half laugh and half sigh. She genuinely believed I was bluffing. In her incredibly arrogant, rigidly constructed worldview, a betrayed, emotionally devastated wife could not possibly possess the sheer intellectual capacity to understand the highly complex, multi-tiered capital structure of a massive hospitality conglomerate. She assumed I had simply rummaged through Adrian's briefcase, memorized a few intimidating financial buzzwords, and was now clumsily attempting to throw them back in her face to salvage a tiny scrap of my shattered pride. She thought I was a child playing with a loaded gun I did not know how to fire. I did not offer her a single word of explanation. I did not elaborate on the specific legal covenants of the bridge loan. I did not mention Red Orchard Holdings. I simply offered her a very faint, deeply chilling smile, turned my back on her, and walked directly toward the heavy glass doors leading back into the main event. Turning my back on her was the ultimate, unforgivable disrespect. It was a physical dismissal that completely shattered her carefully curated aura of absolute authority. As I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped back into the blinding golden light and the deafening noise of the ballroom, I could hear the sharp, angry click of her expensive heels striking the marble floor close behind me, for the very first time in her entire meticulously planned evening. Helena Voss was not leading the procession. She was anxiously following in my wake, trapped in a highly disorienting state of profound confusion. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom had reached a fever pitch of manufactured excitement. The jazz ensemble had completely stopped playing. The room was buzzing with the electric, eager murmur of hundreds of wealthy investors waiting for the grand climax of the night. On the massive, brightly lit stage at the front of the room, the master of ceremonies adjusted his tuxedo jacket and leaned closely into the polished silver microphone. He began a booming, highly enthusiastic introduction, praising the incredible vision, the relentless drive, and the unparalleled future of the young executive who was about to guide Crown Meridian into its most profitable decade yet. Directly below the stage, standing in the dense, glittering crowd, Adrian looked like a man who had just conquered the entire world. His posture was perfectly straight, his handsome face glowing with absolute, unadulterated triumph. He was straightening his silk cuffs, preparing to ascend the carpeted stairs to accept his stolen crown. I did not look at my husband. My eyes tracked smoothly across the crowded floor until I located the severe, unsmiling figure of Malcolm Reed. The chairman of the audit committee was still standing near the perimeter of the room, flanked by his outside special counsel and the silent representative of the primary lending syndicate, exactly as the master of ceremonies shouted Adrian's name, causing the massive room to erupt into deafening applause. A catering staff member in a crisp white uniform quietly approached Malcolm. The waiter carried a small silver tray holding a single, heavily sealed manila envelope. It was the second package, the trigger. Malcolm took the envelope without thanking the waiter. He tore the thick paper open with a swift, violent motion. He pulled out a single sheet of heavily embossed legal paper. I knew exactly what was printed on that page. It was the formal, legally binding notification from Red Orchard Holdings, officially triggering the catastrophic default clauses due to severe, documented vendor fraud and the blatant misrepresentation of the independent reviewing entity. I watched Malcolm Reed's face completely transform in the span of 3 seconds. The grim, observant neutrality vanished, instantly replaced by a terrifying, cold fury. The kind of fury that only a deeply conservative financial purist feels when he realizes he has been actively lied to by the very people entrusted with his massive fortune. He handed the single sheet of paper to the outside special counsel standing directly beside him. She read it in exactly 2 seconds, gave him a single, sharp nod of absolute confirmation, and snapped her leather briefcase shut. Up on the brightly lit stage, Adrian was walking toward the center podium, waving graciously to the cheering crowd. The spotlight followed his every move. He reached out his perfectly manicured hand and wrapped his fingers completely around the silver stem of the microphone. He opened his mouth, drawing in a deep breath to deliver the magnificent, triumphant speech he had undoubtedly been rehearsing in our bathroom mirror for the past 5 weeks. He never got to speak a single word. "Stop the proceedings immediately," a voice boomed across the vast room. Malcolm Reed did not need a microphone to command absolute authority. His voice cut through the deafening applause and the celebratory cheering like a heavy steel blade dropping onto a wooden block. He stepped away from the perimeter of the room and marched directly toward the front of the stage. The dense crowd of wealthy investors instantly parted before him like water. Sensing the sudden, violent shift in the atmospheric pressure, the applause died a rapid, highly uncomfortable death. The massive ballroom, previously buzzing with loud music and laughter, plunged into an absolute, ringing silence. It was the kind of terrifying quiet that immediately precedes a massive structural collapse. I formally request an immediate, mandatory 10-minute delay to all public announcements, Malcolm stated loudly, his voice echoing off the golden walls and the crystal chandeliers. He stood directly at the base of the stage, glaring up at the frozen executives. The audit committee has just been presented with an urgent, highly critical compliance matter that requires immediate executive review. Nobody from the executive board is to leave this venue. The entire room turned completely to stone. The wealthy investors exchanged panicked, confused glances. The master of ceremonies stepped nervously away from the podium, and right at that exact moment, standing perfectly still in the dead center of the frozen crowd, I finally turned my head to look at Helena Voss. She was standing exactly 4 feet to my left. The arrogant smirk had been completely and violently wiped from her beautiful face. Her dark eyes were wide, frantic, and rapidly darting between the furious chairman of the audit committee and the heavy glass doors of the ballroom. As her gaze finally snapped back to mine, the utter confusion in her expression melted away, instantly replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. She finally understood that I had not been bluffing. She finally realized that the quiet, boring wife had not just discovered her cheap affair, but had systematically located the structural pillars of her massive financial fraud and rigged them all to detonate simultaneously. Up on the brightly lit stage, bathed in the harsh glare of the spotlight, my young and handsome husband stood completely frozen with his hands still wrapped tightly around the microphone. His mouth was slightly open. His brow was furrowed in genuine, pathetic confusion. He looked out at the silent, staring crowd, entirely unaware that his glorious, triumphant night had just been violently derailed, and completely ignorant of the fact that the magnificent corporate machine he thought he was about to pilot was currently plummeting directly into the ground. The heavy soundproofed mahogany doors of the private executive salon clicked shut, instantly severing us from the deafening applause and the bright, golden lights of the grand ballroom. The silence inside the room was sudden, absolute, and suffocating. Malcolm Reed took his seat at the head of the long conference table, his face carved from pure, unforgiving granite. He was flanked by the ruthless outside special counsel and the silent, observing representative from the primary lending syndicate, 2 other key members of the board of directors, hastily summoned from the Gala floor, stood rigidly near the back wall. Helena Voss and Adrian Blake were directed to sit on the opposite side of the massive table. They looked like 2 elegant, highly decorated passengers who had just been violently thrown from a speeding train, desperately trying to understand how they had suddenly landed in a sterile interrogation room. I did not sit down immediately. I stood perfectly straight at the far end of the table. I unclasped my small black evening bag, withdrew the highly condensed, meticulously organized dossier I had prepared, and placed it directly onto the polished wood. The soft thud of the heavy paper hitting the table sounded louder than a gunshot. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl passionate accusations. I simply opened the black folder and proceeded to systematically dismantle their entire empire using the exact language they worshipped. I laid out 3 undeniable, mathematically proven facts. First, I presented the raw metadata logs confirming that the name of my company, Right Ledger Advisory, had been fraudulently inserted into the regulatory compliance drafts to explicitly bypass the required independent risk assessment. Second, I presented the traced routing numbers and the incorporation documents proving that the massive vendor payouts were being diverted directly into 2 completely fabricated shell companies, designed exclusively to siphon corporate funds. Finally, I laid out the original, unedited revenue projections side by side with the massively inflated numbers that had been officially submitted to the creditors exactly 1 hour prior. I stepped back and clasped my hands together. The loan application submitted this evening is fundamentally fraudulent, I stated smoothly, looking directly at the lender representative. The representative did not blink. He adjusted his glasses, looked at the undeniable proof resting on the table, and then turned his cold gaze toward Helena. On behalf of the primary and subordinate lending syndicates, I am officially notifying the board that due to the severe falsification of revenue projections and the direct impersonation of an independent reviewing entity, the bridge loan is suspended immediately. Not a single cent will be disbursed. Furthermore, we are instantly activating our contractual right to initiate a comprehensive breach of covenant review. We will be freezing all associated corporate accounts pending a federal audit. The terrifying reality of those words slammed into Helena Voss like a physical blow. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the untouchable, brilliant chief executive shattered completely, revealing a cornered, desperate predator. Her survival instincts, honed over decades of corporate warfare, violently took over. She did not attempt to deny the forged numbers. She knew the digital footprints were absolute. Instead, she executed a flawless, vicious pivot. She stood up abruptly, her crimson silk gown rustling loudly in the quiet room, and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my husband. "This is completely his doing," Helena declared, her voice rising in a pitch of perfectly manufactured outrage. Adrian was the sole executive tasked with managing the vendor approvals for the new acquisitions. He was the one who authorized those shell companies. He is overly ambitious, reckless, and completely out of control. When the underwriters demanded an independent review, he panicked. He took it upon himself to use his own wife's company name to illegally rubber stamp his rogue financial structuring. I had absolutely no knowledge of his administrative manipulations. Adrian sat entirely frozen in his chair, the color completely drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He turned his head slowly, staring at the powerful woman he had chosen over his marriage. The woman who had whispered promises of endless power and shared empires into his ear just hours ago. He was watching her feed him directly into the churning blades of a federal indictment without a single second of hesitation. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to scream that she had ordered him to do it. But the outside special counsel cut him off. She opened her leather briefcase, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it directly across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of Adrian. "Mr. Blake," the special counsel said, her tone devoid of any human warmth. "This is an internal human resources memorandum drafted on Ms. Voss's private terminal 2 days ago. It explicitly details your unilateral, rogue actions regarding the fraudulent vendors and the forged audit documents. It was fully prepared to be handed to the authorities the moment this transaction was audited. You were never intended to be a partner. You were always the designated liability." Adrian stared at the paper. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He was experiencing the ultimate, agonizing realization that he was not the king on the board. He was simply a beautiful, disposable shield. Before the room could fully absorb his complete destruction, I delivered the final, fatal strike. I picked up my phone, tapped the screen once, and placed it in the center of the table. It was a recovered digital voice memo. It was a panicked, late-night audio message Adrian had recorded and sent to his fraternity brother Julian, the man running one of the shell companies. When the pressure of the fraud had momentarily overwhelmed him, Adrian's recorded voice echoed loudly in the silent salon. "Julian, you have to ensure the routing numbers are completely buried. Helena is riding me relentlessly about this. She specifically told me to leverage my marriage. She told me to exploit my insider knowledge of Savannah's firm and use her professional credibility to pad the application so the underwriters would not look too closely. If my wife finds out I am using her name to secure Helena's debt, she will destroy both of us. Just clean up the digital trail." The audio file clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy as lead. Every single escape route, every possible deniability, was completely and permanently sealed. Malcolm Reed stood up. He did not look at Helena or Adrian. He looked directly at the other board members. "The audit committee recommends the immediate suspension of Helena Voss, effective this exact second, for severe documented cause. We will permanently cancel the public promotion of Adrian Blake. All executive access, digital and physical, is completely frozen. We will open a full independent forensic investigation tomorrow morning, and we will be surrendering this entire dossier to the appropriate federal financial regulatory authorities. The board members nodded in unison. The empire was officially dismantled. The most agonizing twist of the entire night belonged exclusively to Adrian. He looked desperately at Helena, begging for intervention, but she refused to even make eye contact with him. He then turned his terrified, pleading eyes toward me. He looked exactly like the lost, panicked 24-year-old boy I had met 7 years ago, silently begging me to fix his massive mistakes, to edit his resume, to save him from his own incompetence. But I simply looked back at him with the cold, detached professionalism of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt account. He was left sitting in the middle of the room, discarded like a dirty, useless appendix that neither of the two women in his life required anymore, in a final, pathetic act of desperation. Helena turned her attention back to me. She dropped her voice to a frantic, negotiating whisper, completely abandoning her pride. "Savannah, please, we can contain this. I can offer you millions. I can transfer a massive block of preferred shares directly into your secure trusts. I can create a permanent, highly compensated honorary advisory seat for you on the executive board. Just withdraw the default notice. Name your absolute price for your silence." I picked up my empty black folder. I looked at the woman who had tried to steal my husband, my home, and my professional identity. "Helena," I said, my voice perfectly steady and serene, "this evening no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the people currently taking the official meeting minutes." I turned my back on them for the final time and walked out of the heavy mahogany doors, leaving them trapped in the terrifying, inescapable wreckage of their own arrogant design. Several months later, the corporate landscape was completely unrecognizable. Helena Voss was aggressively stripped of her chief executive title, officially denied her massive golden parachute severance package, and her once legendary professional reputation was brutally torn to shreds in the financial press. She was facing multiple, incredibly serious federal indictments. Adrian was completely blacklisted from the entire hospitality industry. He was entangled in an incredibly unfavorable, highly publicized divorce proceeding, buried under a mountain of civil lawsuits from angry investors, and desperately fighting to avoid federal prison time. I, however, kept exactly what belonged to me. I retained the entirety of my personal financial assets. I fiercely protected the unblemished reputation of my company. In fact, the quiet, terrifying rumors of how I had flawlessly dismantled a corrupt conglomerate actually caused a massive surge in my elite corporate clientele. The story ends not with a screaming match or a dramatic, messy confrontation. It ends with me, sitting completely alone in my beautiful sunlit office early on a Tuesday morning. I quietly closed the finalized divorce decree, feeling the profound, unbreakable peace of a woman who did not seek revenge through chaotic emotion, but rather by understanding the mechanics of the system infinitely better than the arrogant fools who mistakenly believed they controlled it. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments, so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by more people.